Howdy everyone, it's CowTipper Vern again. Today I'm going to talk about storytelling, mythology, parables, things like that. 2x2s love stories, they love to tell stories, they love to hear them. As 2x2s we were raised on stories, raised learning about them. It makes up our belief system, and as I got older, I had more and more problems with that, and ultimately, the reason I wanted to talk about them today is because storytelling is part of what caused me to question meetings and ultimately leave. A big part of my deconstruction was realizing that the storytelling wasn't helping. It was making life worse for a lot of people, so I'm going to talk about that a little bit today. 2x2s typically take the Bible literally, and when I was growing up, I did too, for the most part. I'm not exactly sure how literally I took the Bible because I didn't really think about it. I think that we're all raised trying to make the Bible literal in our minds. We didn't learn that the Bible was stories. We learned the Bible was historically accurate. And of course, that doesn't make any sense. So we tried to squeeze that idea through the keyhole of our belief system and make it work, just make it fit. The Bible is full of a lot of mythology and stories and things, and that isn't to say that they're not true. Surely a lot of it's built around true stories. But I'm sure there's a game of telephone going on with a lot of it. I'm not going to dig in too deeply to the specific stories of the Bible today, because that's not really the point. I may mention a few as we go just to make an illustration, but I believed the Bible for a long time. I believed it literally for a lot of my life. And so I don't hold that against anybody if they still do. But I know for myself that that's just not true anymore. 2x2s love the stories in the Bible. They love to talk about them. They love to read them over and over. They often talk about the story of Jesus. The first hymn in our hymnal was, "Tell me the story of Jesus." They would talk about it as the greatest story ever told and things like that, which makes sense in their belief system. But I never knew exactly where to draw the line with what was real and what wasn't. Of course, I grew up believing Jesus was real, of course, and the New Testament definitely happened. The Old Testament, I wasn't sure, but I kind of had to believe it when I was young, so I just tried to make it work. I spent a lot of my time when I was younger trying to make the Old Testament work. I loved reading newspaper articles when somebody would say they found some evidence of some flood or something, or they found some boat in the mountains because, hey, that means Noah probably happened. There was a part of me that knew that that didn't make any sense, but another part of me, an equally large part of me, that wanted it to be true and wanted it to make sense because I needed my belief system to work. I knew the more I thought about it, the more it would be a problem, so I just didn't do it. I just didn't think about it. I think when you're a believing Christian, the Bible needs to be true on some level, so you want it to be true completely, and you're always looking for ways to prove that those stories are real and really happened, and that can give you a pass on how to deal with the rest of the Bible. You don't have to defend a lot of your faith if you can prove that it's true in the first place, if that makes any sense. You don't have to justify the parable if the parable is just a true fact. If it's just a story, you kind of have to think about how it matters to you. If the story's not literally true, then there's some interpretation involved, and that's a little bit uncomfortable because now you have to defend that. And so I think a lot of people don't do that. If the stories aren't literally true, then the value has to come from some other way. And that takes a lot of interpretation and a lot of thought, and that's really difficult. It's much easier if all those stories are just true. I think that's how I viewed it when I was younger. I didn't know how to read them, and so I just hoped that they were true. As I got older, I just tried to think less and less about it because I don't want to think about that. I don't want to think about the fact that the stories might not actually be true and I have to put more work into it. But I had a period in my life where I started thinking about it again. I started thinking about the stories as mythology and why that might be important. I think there was a period in my life where I realized that the stories probably weren't true. To put my cards on the table, I think a lot of the stories in the Bible probably are not literally true. I think they're probably stories that got passed down and handed around and a lot of word of mouth, game of telephone type of stuff. They may have grains of truth in them. They may have origins of real people and things like that, but I don't think, I'm not a Bible literalist, let's say that. I've never believed in young earth. Even as a child, I knew that probably wasn't true. Even when I was fairly young, I believed that evolution probably happened, although I was constantly trying to wedge that into the Bible to make it all true. I wasn't so sure about the flood, but I didn't talk about that. My wife and I have talked publicly about how we didn't even really talk to each other about our beliefs until we left meetings. It's not that we were trying to hide anything from each other, but we didn't necessarily want to cause any friction. We didn't want to cause any doubt for the other one. One of the things was one time I remember saying that I wasn't sure that Noah's flood was true, and that really bothered her. I'm not sure that she'd thought about it, but the fact that I didn't believe the Bible was literally 100% true really did bother her. So we didn't talk about that anymore. And we've talked about it a lot more since. Looking back, what I realize now was deconstruction started while I was going to meetings, when I wasn't sure what to teach my kids. I'd hear stories in meeting, and then the kids would ask us on the way home about whatever we heard. And I was never exactly sure what to tell them, because deep down, I just didn't believe all of it was actually true. And when I say true, I mean literally true. I didn't actually believe that the entire world was flooded and Noah had all the animals on a boat. But if that story comes up in meeting, what am I going to say? One time we had a worker at our house, and we asked her about young Earth, and she said that we believe that the Earth is 6,000 years old. Unquestioningly, we believe that. She spoke for all of us. She was an older sister worker, and that was very important to her belief system to believe that. That didn't sit exactly right with me, but I tried to make it not matter. I just put it aside in my head. This doesn't need to matter. But about that time in my life, I was starting to have, I think doubts would be the correct word now, but I didn't think of them as doubts. I just wanted to learn more. I realized that I wasn't getting what I wanted to out of going to meetings. I listened to the workers and I just didn't get anything out of it. And I prayed about it and thought about it and read my Bible some, probably not as much as a lot of people, but I did read it. And at one point I came across someone online who was talking about Bible stories from a psychological standpoint and was talking about why the stories in the Old Testament were significant to the people back then, or at least speculating on that. I'm not going to say who it is because I'm embarrassed that I ever listened to this person now, but at the time, it scratched that itch for me. I was listening to lectures, 2-3 hour long lectures about old Bible stories like Cain and Abel and Garden of Eden and Noah and all these different things. And I was fascinated with it. I listened over and over to some of these lectures because in a way it was answering a question that I had, which was, what is the point of these stories? And I knew that the person giving these lectures was just giving their opinion. That's fine. I didn't have a problem with that. I didn't see that as truth. I just thought, that's a different angle on it. And I really appreciated that. And I have to be honest, to this day, I kind of like that. I kind of like some of the ways this person looked into the Bible stories. Even now when I hear those stories, I hear people who don't believe the Bible trashing old mythological stories in the Old Testament. And there's a part of me that's like, no, I kind of like them though. There's certain parts of them that make sense. If you think about the context of the people in the Old Testament listening to these stories and handing them down, there might have been some value there. And I don't actually see that as a bad thing necessarily. So I listened to those lectures, and I didn't speak about any of the lectures in meeting in my testimonies, but I thought about them. I would listen to the lecture, and then I would go read the Bible story myself. And I'm sure the things I heard played into my testimonies for a while, but it gave me a little bit of breathing room for a while. What had started already for me was deconstruction, and I didn't want to think of it as deconstruction. I wouldn't have thought of it that way. It's not that I didn't want to. It just never would have occurred to me. I just wanted to learn about the Bible in a way that would give more significance than what I was hearing about in gospel meetings. We'd go to gospel meeting and hear the same stale thing over and over, and something about the 3 or 4 stories that workers ever talk about, like the sower and the seed and all this. They take the most straightforward parables and talk about them over and over, and that wasn't doing it for me. I wanted to dig into stuff that was a little more complex and a little more in depth. Complex maybe isn't the right word, but interesting. Let's just say that. I wanted to hear something that was more interesting. So hearing a Bible scholar, or somebody who studied the Bible anyway, talking about the significance or potential significance psychologically that these stories may have had on the groups of people being told them was interesting to me. But I was very aware during this whole process that this meant that I was no longer taking the Bible literally. And there was a little internal struggle with that. I wasn't sure what to think of myself doing that. I felt like maybe I was becoming a different kind of a Christian than I thought I was. But that kind of felt okay because I knew that at some point I was going to have to teach my kids. And my kids were already in meeting listening, but they had questions I couldn't really answer. They had questions that were very pointed, and I was very uncomfortable with them because I knew that the professing version of those answers wasn't really honest coming from me. If I told them the professing answer to these questions, it wouldn't make any sense to me, and that was the problem. So I just lived in that space for a long time. I just lived in that space of the Bible may or may not be true. The workers say it has to be true. It has to be literal. I don't really feel that it is, but maybe I can just live this way without that. Maybe I could just live this way thinking that there's significance to the Bible, that it matters for us, that God's speaking to us in a way that helps us in some way. It helps us be better people. It helps us be a better society or a better group or whatever, a better professing meeting, growing bunch of people. But that doesn't mean it's true. And I was prepared to live that way for a long time. Again, never thinking that that had anything to do with my stance as professing. As far as I knew, I was just going to keep professing for a long time, and this is just the next step in the growth of my faith. Even in hindsight, this should have worked. It seems like it should have worked for me to blend appreciation for stories that I was seeing as mythological with the 2x2's love of telling them, regardless of who believed what. It should have worked, but it didn't really. It should have worked because 2x2's love stories. In fact, I think they like the stories better than the truth anyway. 2x2's love to hear the story. Not just the story of Jesus, they love to hear any kind of story. Anything from a story out of the Bible to gossip. They always start with the story of how the gospel found them. Who in their family found the truth, they say, and how that happened. The workers came to their door on a dark and stormy night, or they were searching everywhere and found the truth. They found a gospel meeting. They were searching everywhere high and low for truth, and lo and behold, some workers were holding a gospel meeting locally, and they went and they knew right away, that as soon as they saw the buns and skirts, they knew they were in. I have stories like that in my own family tree. Professing people love that story. They value highly the story of how God found them, with his ministry in particular. Workers love those stories too. They love the stories of a conversion. I remember when I was younger at conventions, they used to do the Wednesday night meeting, the first meeting of the convention. It wasn't really an official meeting of the convention. You wouldn't count it toward the 4 days, but it was the Wednesday night going into a convention that would last Thursday, Friday, Saturday, Sunday. When I was younger, I loved the Wednesday night meeting because they would talk about, they would have a worker who had been overseas, quote unquote. When you're professing the United States is the center of the universe and everything else is overseas. So they would have an overseas worker come up and talk about a conversion in a foreign land. And that land isn't like ours. It's an adventure over there. They got a different word for everything. They would describe the culture. They would describe how difficult it was to find people over there, but God found them. God led them to find somebody. And there was one person who professed, and the rest of their family treated them badly, but they kept on doing it, and that person is still there to this day. Now, of course, the fact that a conversion story usually involved one or two people out of years of labor now comes across as sad to me, but at the time it was encouraging to know that God was working in every land and was finding people everywhere. But we love those stories. They were interesting. They were definitely more interesting than hearing about the sower and seed again. So the Wednesday night meeting, the first meeting of convention, was always my favorite. As we got older, they stopped doing that meeting, and I'm not sure why. I think that they probably were worried about talking about the foreign lands where they weren't supposed to be legally. I'm not sure. Eventually, they stopped doing that practice altogether, and they just had a regular gospel meeting on Wednesday, and it was boring. And those boring meetings continue unto this day. But it's not just the conversion stories that they love. They love any story. They love a story about somebody doing something that sounds vaguely biblical. They love a story that has some parable quality to it. There are so many stories about somebody who had doubt, then something came along that pointed them back to God. And by God, they mean going to meetings. All of the stories lead you back to meeting, no matter what, as they do. Every church does this. All of their stories of God reaching his hand down to earth pushes them back to whatever church they came from in the first place. As I've gotten older, I've realized that a lot of those stories probably aren't true. Many of those stories get repeated by different workers in different places, even some of the same details. Something I found interesting since leaving is finding out how often those stories are told by different people. And I'm starting to think that most of them aren't true at all. I don't know. Maybe some of them are. Maybe it's just like the Bible. The story started out real, and game of telephone, person to person over years and years, the stories have changed a little bit. They've refined the story a little bit. It's got good laugh lines now. It's got lines that make you tear up. They're very moving, but I don't think they're real. I'm not sure that they are. Some of them may be. But someone pointed out to me one time that young workers starting out in the ministry immediately start telling those stories. As soon as they go into the work, these workers who are in their early 20s oftentimes will start telling the same exact stories that they've heard. Because of course the stories don't actually have a name. The person doesn't have a name. They're just a story. They're just apocryphal. They're just a story that we can all learn from. And it doesn't matter who it is, really, because the point of the story is that God is working. Isn't that right? Well, the problem is the person who told the story definitely didn't write the story. It came from somebody else. And that's been happening for so long that a lot of people are doubting that those stories came from anywhere. They might just be stories somebody made up. Several people have reached out to us and pointed out that workers they knew were getting stories online. They just sounded good. They were these parable sounding stories they found online. And they'd bring them to meeting and say them as if they were real, as if they knew these people. And of course they weren't. I think they think that people don't check online, but people do. So the question is, do these stories matter? Well, they matter in that they keep people in meeting. There's always a warning to these stories. The story is always a triumphant one about somebody who found meetings and came back, or maybe they were tempted by worldly things, but then they came to meeting and found peace or whatever, or somebody who was a really good example and then their friend at school professed or their family professed or something. Something happened that more people were added to the church in some way. Those are the good stories. The other stories are terrible, and there's a lot of those stories. When I was younger, I remember some older brother workers who were very artful and very skilled at telling dark stories. And you don't hear those as often now, thank goodness. But when I was younger, I remember hearing stories all the time of people who said no to God and then died. There's a whole genre of worker story that essentially amount to the worker version of the Grimm's Brothers fairy tales. Somebody doesn't do something they're supposed to do, and let that be a lesson because this person had something bad happen to them. There's lots of stories of people not professing when God moves them to profess. God wants them to stand up in a gospel meeting and they don't, and then they go home and they crash their car. That happens all the time. That car crash story, there's so many variants of it, it's kind of alarming. But the story is the same all the time. Somebody didn't listen to God and crashed their car. A lot of times they died. These stories are crazy. They didn't happen, I'm sure. Not to say that that couldn't happen. Of course, the stories are just generic enough that you could say, well, yeah, that did happen to somebody I know. But that makes them even worse because if you can attach a name to them, then you can scare little kids even more. The other genre of story I remember and really don't like are the stories of people who endured a lot to be professing. When the workers tell kids that they're going to have to endure a lot, it preps the kids to be abused. And of course, now you can see what happened with that. At convention, when I was younger, I distinctly remember hearing a story about a woman whose husband beat her, but she was forgiving. The point of the story was to be forgiving. And she just prayed to God, and God gave her the strength to get through. Mind you, people believe the workers are their spiritual leaders who speak to God directly, who will do anything a worker says because the worker is not only speaking for God, was sent to them by God. It's not an abstract thing. It's very tangible. These workers bring you the message of God. And so when they're telling kids, hey, you might get hassled at school because you always have to dress like that and you can't watch TV, or here's a story about a woman who got abused and assaulted, but she just forgave and moved on. You're setting an entire group up to be abused and not stand up for themselves and never learn how to interact in the world. It's an abusive way to even tell stories. And now, as you can see that the entire group is swamped in a CSA scandal, you can see how that's a problem. That story writes itself too. All these things are horrifying. Telling people that if they don't profess, they're going to die in a car crash, that if they're being abused, they should just turn the other cheek, that their friends are going to make fun of them at school and that's right and good and makes them even better and God loves them even more. All that stuff is crazy. It's really crazy. It's really abusive. And it teaches people to be abused, that being abused is righteous. It doesn't teach them the message they say it teaches them, which is that we should turn the other cheek and be good and Christ-like. It teaches them to never question authority, even if authority is abusive to them. After I'd left meetings, I was listening to some podcasts from people who are deconstructing different faiths, specifically the LDS faith. And I just started laughing out loud one time when they started talking about the car crash thing. LDS people are told all the time that if they're unwilling, it's possible that they'll die in a car crash. And when I heard that, I went to my wife immediately and I was like, you got to be kidding me. Other religions do the car crash thing. We talk about the car crash thing all the time. They all do that. They all threaten you that if you don't get right with the church, you could die in a car crash. It's really vile. It's an abusive way to treat people. I really, really don't like it. These stories about bad things will happen to you if you don't listen to God create a real abusive relationship between you and the creator of everything. And that's one of the things I just couldn't pass on to my kids. I couldn't pass on the idea that if you don't do things exactly right, the one who created you will hate you for it, will treat you badly, and that you should accept that that's righteous and good. I couldn't handle that. I couldn't handle that idea. I couldn't teach my kid that if they say no to God, God's going to accept no as an answer and do something terrible to them. This whole sometimes God accepts no concept is just awful to me. I find it very hard to stomach it. But it's very common in meetings. They love to hear about people who didn't do what they're doing, which is put in the effort to get to a meeting. They love to hear that people who didn't do that were punished by God. It's not just that there's extra blessing in coming to a convention and sitting on a hard bench for a few days. It's also helpful to know that people who don't do that are in danger of being killed. It's wild to say out loud. When you say it out loud, it's like, how in the world did we listen to any of this ever? But they're still doing it. Those stories still go around. Less all the time, but when I was young, those were very, very common. People just love hearing stories. People love hearing these stories because it confirms something in them. There's a confirmation bias to it, I think. I think that people just love to hear the stories, even though they're awful stories, even though they're terrible, even though they're abusive, even though it takes a person who might be a good, honest person and turns them into a quivering mass of scrupulosity. Anybody else would see that as abusive. Professing people see that as wonderful and confirming. They see love there. And these stories that I would say now are abusive are considered loving to a professing person. That's the thing that I couldn't get over as I was raising my own kids. I couldn't tell them stories that on their face were abusive, and yet people thought they were loving. I couldn't conflate those two terms. The thing is, when you're bothered by these stories, the first thing you're going to want to know is, well, do I have to believe this? Are they true? If you're professing, you don't care if they're true. You do care, but you sort of have to take for granted that they are, because once again, if you start thinking about what the story's actually saying, that's kind of scary, and that's a bit of a deconstruction on the fly. So if you know that you have to believe the story, you're not going to dig into how true it is. I think a lot of people can't live in that world of this might be mythology, this might be true. This might just be an apocryphal story. The story of somebody who said no to God and then died of a heart attack in their kitchen, another story I heard several different variants of. You don't want to believe that that's true, but also you kind of have to because the worker told it. So there's obviously some value there. So you're going to have to believe it's true. Your only choice is to just obey, obey, obey. Just do the best you can all the time. If you start thinking about it, you'll leave. And ultimately, I think that's what happened to me. I started thinking about these stories and they started bothering me. This all came to a head for me during COVID, when there was a lot of mythology going on, a lot of conspiracy theories, a lot of real-time myth-making about reality. Once again, I was sort of okay with believing that the Bible wasn't necessarily literal, but I was trying to find good meaning from it anyway. And that was getting more and more difficult to do, but it felt like the right thing to do to try. It felt like I was being a good example if I would give it an effort, if I would give it a shot. I would try to get something out of the Bible, even if I didn't believe it was entirely true. But then COVID came along and I started watching myth-making in real time. And I think that's when I realized that maybe none of the Bible is true. All of this stuff that I'm saying about myth-making and storytelling and liking the parables, liking stories, is all verbiage that I'm adding to it more recently. At the time, I wasn't thinking that way. But I started thinking that way when COVID started, when COVID spread from wherever it started to the United States. And people started getting very sick, and it was affecting a lot of people we knew. A few people we knew passed away. And as I watched professing people interact with COVID, I was pretty shocked. One of the first conversations I had with a professing person about COVID was centered around a bunch of conspiracy theories that are still prevalent. They're still around. The QAnon stuff that was going on. But they're nonsense, and I knew they were nonsense, out of hand. And I entered into a new part of my life, which was learning about conspiracy theories, learning about QAnon, learning about all these people who were denying COVID. And I was fascinated by it. I honestly, I went down my own type of rabbit hole, pardon the phrase, just learning about QAnon, learning about conspiracy theories and people who made them up. We had a very tangible issue on our hands, very tangible. COVID was very real, very tangible. It was right in front of us. It was hurting people around us. And yet there was a certain faction of society that were just making up myths on the fly. And those myths are indelible. Those myths are lasting even till today. People were just making up stories and then believing them. I had always seen mythology as maybe fitting a story to reality. Like maybe reality is difficult. Maybe it's hard to tell a story. Maybe it's hard to recount reality accurately. Maybe remembering all the facts is hard. Maybe making sense of the world is hard. But a story you can remember helps you through that. Having a parable, having a myth, helps you interact with reality. And I realized when COVID was happening that that's where I was with all of this, that I believed that the mythology in the Bible, whether the events happened or not, didn't really matter to me anymore. I believed that the storytelling in the Bible, and then therefore the storytelling in meetings, was meant to help people with reality. It was meant to paint reality in a way that was easier to remember, easier to process, that it was helpful in some way, that it helped us seek God, that it helped us be good to each other, to be a better community, stuff like that. But when COVID came along and people started just making up stories left and right, I realized that that wasn't true either. People can make up myths for any reason, sometimes just because they wanted to, because it matched their worldview. And I was really disappointed to watch professing people doing that. Falling down the rabbit hole, as it were, falling head over heels into conspiracy theories that were very obviously just made up on the fly to justify a worldview, and professing people were falling for it. I was shocked by that. I talked to many professing people who were discounting everything they saw in reality in favor of QAnon mythology that was just online that morning. They would see some nonsense online and they would buy it. And I all of a sudden realized, oh, the professing tendency to put everything into story is actually making it harder for people to deal in reality. It's making it harder for the friends to understand what they're seeing. Reality is complex, and the stories aren't simplifying it for them. The stories are lying to them, and they're falling for it. That was a shocking, shocking realization to me. That professing people, because they were raised on stories, because they live so much of their life based on mythology and storytelling to make sense of the world, had somewhere along the line stopped making sense of the world and were just living by these stories. The sense they were making of the world came through the stories. They wanted the stories first. I heard workers denying COVID and denying vaccines from the platform. A worker wrote a long letter about how the COVID vaccine might have the mark of the beast in it. He was sidelined for a while, but I was shocked, absolutely shocked that a worker would write something like that. In my own area, people didn't believe in masks. They wouldn't wear them. There was one little meeting set aside to have people who were too afraid of COVID, who were just having too much fear. They didn't have enough faith. They had too much fear. They could go to that meeting. If you wanted to wear a mask, you could go to the mask meeting. And then I would see professing people online saying things like faith over fear, as if faith is supposed to tell you to go against reality. I realized in that moment that my faith was centered around believing things I couldn't see, even though I accepted what I could see. I believed in God, couldn't see God, but I believed him. I believed in him. I believed that he existed and built the earth or whatever. But the tension always came with looking at reality and thinking, well, maybe the Noah flood didn't happen, but maybe it doesn't matter. Maybe that's a myth. Maybe it's a parable. It doesn't really matter. I still believe in God because I can't see him, but if I see evidence, I have to accept the evidence. So my faith was believing in things I couldn't see. But in the professing world, faith was being displayed by not believing things that they could see. And that was downright offensive to me. it hurt to watch. It hurt to watch people I know very well and respect just making up stories about things as people were dying. And I realized that that mythology, whatever was causing them to believe that mythology, was actually stopping them from seeing reality. It was getting in the way. Their tendency toward parables and their tendency toward mythology, their love of storytelling, was stopping them from accepting reality. The stories weren't telling them to be careful. The stories were telling them to throw caution aside and go have a meeting anyway. The mythology around their own belief system was telling them that the government was trying to stop them from having meetings. That this whole COVID thing was just the world trying to stop them from worshiping God yet again. I thought that your faith could maybe get you through this. That maybe if we had faith, we could step aside from meetings for a minute, meet in other ways, maybe have text meetings, which we did for a little while. Maybe keep in touch with our elders, keep in touch with our workers, and work it out. Have faith in God, and we'll meet up soon enough. Instead, they threw aside reality, started telling stories about life that weren't real, started telling stories about how the world was trying to stop them from having meetings and going and having meetings anyway. They were showing their faith by ignorance. And when I realized that faith was ignorance, I had to step aside. The thing that broke my proverbial shelf was a worker sending an email to us saying that we really needed to stop worrying about COVID. We need to stop worrying about getting COVID because what's really important is getting to meetings. And this worker went into the Old Testament and pulled a story about a plague. And he pulled out a part of a verse, of course, because workers never even use whole verses anymore. They rarely will they actually tell an entire story. They'll just grab part of a verse. And the part of a verse that this worker grabbed was talking about how God put the plagues on the houses. His point was, hey, we might just get COVID, but God decides who gets COVID. We need to not worry so much about it. We need to not get so excited about it. We need to not get so spun up about who's getting sick and who's dying. Let's not worry so much about that. Let's get back to meeting. And I realized that the spiritual leader for our area was using a story in the Old Testament that may or may not be real to tell his people to ignore reality. And I was done. That was it for me. My wife read that letter to me over the phone, and I said out loud for the very first time, we're not going back. Because it hit me so hard that everything I was worried about was true. The love of stories and the love of parables in God's word, quote unquote, were making people more ignorant and more likely to hurt each other, not better. They weren't helping them get through life. They weren't using these stories to do better. They were using the stories to justify not doing better, doing worse. Rather than those stories giving them insight into how the world works and how to live a better life, they were excusing ignorance and excusing them not learning more, not doing better, taking less care of the people around them. I'm not going to judge anybody about what they think happened with COVID, and I've never asked anybody what their vaccine status is because I don't care. But I do care how much you care about other people. And if you're going to justify treating people badly, right up to and including injuring or killing them, because you found some phrase in the Bible that makes it make sense for you, that's not the Bible telling you to do that. That's you deciding that. That's you making a decision. When people read through the Bible and find things that help them treat people badly, it means that they've made that decision and they want to justify it. They don't have to do that. Professing people can go into any part of the Bible and find stuff that helps them justify themselves. You know, Jesus gave parables about rich people being bad, and professing people have no problem having as much money as you can imagine. They've negotiated with the text in a way to justify themselves. But they've also found justification in the text to treat people badly, to abuse children, to ignore allegations, and in the case of COVID, to justify not worrying about it, to justify not worrying if someone was hurt, or in some cases even died. And that's a huge struggle for me now, looking back on my belief system, realizing that the belief system made people worse people. I haven't gotten over that one yet. And I'll talk about my own beliefs another time maybe, but that's where I'm at with that. I like stories. I like a good story if there's a purpose to it. But I think that the stories should probably attach you to reality more, not separate you from it. Similes and metaphors and parables and myths are all good, can be good. But if they make you more vulnerable and they make you more likely to hurt yourself and hurt others, I don't think that's good. And looking back on the way stories are told in the 2x2s, I see that across the board now. I see how kids were told that they might get abused by their classmates, but that was good and righteous. That spouses might hurt each other, but that was okay, turn the other cheek. We might be attacked by the government, but that's okay, we're right. And if you don't try to be right, and if you don't show up to meeting, God might actually take your life. And that would be good, and that would be right. All these stories are ridiculous. And I think it does matter that they're not true. I actually do think that now. I used to not really care that much, but now I think you should have a true story if you're going to tell a story like that. When I look back now and realize that all those stories were being told to us from a very young age, it doesn't surprise me how many people fell down the QAnon rabbit hole unknowingly, didn't know it was coming. But it made sense to them when they saw it. The QAnon rabbit hole made more sense to them than what they were seeing in front of themselves. And now that there's a CSA crisis going on in the 2x2s, it makes more sense to them, many of them, that everyone's out to get them, that the bitter X's are after them, that the government's trying to shut them down and stop their belief system, stop them from worshiping. Because that's what they've been hearing their whole life. They're looking for that. They're looking for reasons that somebody is trying to stop them from going to meetings. They're looking for that. They're looking for ways where the world might be trying to stop them from going to meetings. And I don't think that's good. I don't think storytelling should detach you from reality. When you read old Grimm's Brothers tales or even old Disney stories or whatever, wherever Disney got all those stories, there's always a little bit of truth in them mixed in with a crazy story. There's a moral lesson or something. But within the 2x2s, all the storytelling just told them to go to meeting no matter what, even if it was a risk to them physically. And I feel like that's unhealthy. And when I realized that that's all those stories were doing, that's what broke my shelf. When I saw real life myth making in action during COVID, that's when I realized I had to get out because it wasn't healthy and it wasn't safe for me anymore. All of the myths that they tell, all the parables they tell, all the stories they tell are just us versus them. Other people are trying to stop us, but we want to go to meeting. We're the good guys, everyone else is the bad guys. Now, on some level, that is all storytelling, right? On some level, everything's a hero's journey, and you'd like to be the hero in the story. But I would suggest checking those stories and making sure you're not hurting somebody else in the process. I would suggest avoiding collateral. Mythology can simplify complex ideas and help us interact in the world, and that's a good thing. But if it oversimplifies it and gives us an inaccurate view of the world, that is a problem. And if you oversimplify complex situations, you can accidentally put yourself in danger. And I felt that was what was happening in the 2x2s. And the scandal we're watching rage through the 2x2s right now is a good example of what happens when you've been telling those us versus them stories for 100+ years. When every single thing you say is filtered through a parable or a story about everybody's out to get us, and the people who don't agree with us are against us, this is what happens. You end up pitting yourself against everyone, including people inside who have been victimized by you. That's a problem. Storytelling has a purpose, but I don't think that's it. At best, storytelling helps the listener grasp an important concept, but at worst, storytelling actually makes the listener less informed and more in danger. And I think that's how I would summarize 2x2 storytelling. At risk of getting too much into my own beliefs quite yet, I will say that just because a story is in the Bible doesn't mean that acting out that story makes it good. That acting out that story in your own life is actually a good thing. I'm not sure if I can make that leap. And I definitely can't make that leap now. I'm not sure if I could while I was in either. But if I were inside, I would really have to think about that now. Just because the story gives you good vibes and helps you identify with your group, professing people in this case, doesn't mean it's an accurate story or that it's even helpful. Sometimes those stories just make you feel better, but that might not mean it's accurate, and it might not mean you're any more safe or oriented to the world in a positive way than you were before you heard the story. Stories should supplement reality, not replace it. 2x2s love stories to the point that they don't believe reality a lot of times, and they paper over that incongruity by calling it faith. And I think that's the danger of faith. I don't want to turn anyone against the idea of faith. Having faith in a higher power is fine by me. I don't worry about that at all. That's not something that I would ever want to take away from somebody. But I would say that faith shouldn't replace reality when you can see reality. Sometimes faith gives you belief in something that you can't see, but it should never cover something you do see, in my opinion. That's just my thoughts on it. My deconstruction centered around the idea that I didn't want to have faith if faith was ignorant of or contradicted reality. And I believe the 2x2 faith does that a lot. And I think that's a problem. And I think that's exactly why they are where they are now, trying to replace reality with what they call faith through parables and stories. But we are seeing a few changes, though. I've noticed in the last few years, since Brewergate, as we'll call it, the CSA scandal, I've noticed that even workers are nudging the goalpost on some of these stories. The story around their own founding, the story of how their faith came to be, which is it came from Jesus and the shores of Galilee, even that is being nudged a little bit. I've seen several letters from workers recently talking about how some brothers were spoken to by God and started this way, essentially. In more words, but that's what they're saying. And I think that's interesting. I think that the reality that the 2x2s were essentially started by a man and a few of his friends is less and less deniable all the time. And so the myth of this goes back to the shores of Galilee is starting to dissolve a little bit. And I think that's good. I think that's a positive step because I think accepting reality on reality's terms is always a positive step. But it's going to be hard for some people because their belief system was based on the story that this went back unbroken all the way to Jesus. A lot of people's faith in the meetings depends on that being true. And as more and more workers are starting to admit that it's not true, that's going to bother some people. And I don't envy them. I don't want that for them. I don't want to crash someone into a faith crisis, but they're going to have to accept that at some point. But I think it's healthy because believing that your way is the one true only way that goes back to the shores of Galilee, or in the case of some older worker letters, that this went all the way back to the Garden of Eden, I think that mythology lands you in a place where you're not allowed to question and you're not allowed to talk and you're not allowed to interact with reality at all because reality itself stops your belief system. Reality itself contradicts that. And doing away with some of these parables and these stories about ourselves and the mythology around ourselves and accepting reality instead is going to be difficult. There's a faith crisis there, but hopefully it'll make us better people. Because let's be honest, some of these stories just aren't true. And telling lies to replace reality isn't an immoral or ethical thing to do, in my opinion. I think that the stories we tell ourselves should make us more self-reflective. They should cause us to think more critically, not less. They shouldn't shut down our thoughts. They should increase our thoughts. They should broaden our view, make us think even more deeply about what we believe. And I think we'll get there. Maybe sometime in the future state, the 2x2s will be a little more oriented to reality. And maybe that'll be forced through this crisis that they're going through right now. I don't wish a crisis on anybody, but I do wish a better grasp of reality on everyone. For me, it meant leaving meetings. And I'm glad I did it. I think it was the right thing for me to do. I can live more honestly, not having to buy into storytelling. I can live more honestly now, and that means I can write my own story.